Okay. Can you guys see my screen? Full screen, everything's good? Okay, good. Don't want any technical difficulties here. So Josh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about sharing with you all today and hopefully having a great discussion. I'm going to try to run through some of this so that we can kind of discuss and get feedback and dig in a little bit at the end. So let's jump right on in. A little about me. I'm LaRae. My friends call me Ray. Make a short name shorter. I am passionate about creating intentional spaces. And to me, intentional spaces are those spaces that, sorry, one second. One, provide platforms for underserved stories. Two, prioritize sacred artifacts and archives of BIPOC folks. Three, facilitate critical conversations. Four, communicate dignity and a sense of belonging. And then five, spaces that move people to action. So these are the things that really motivate me. Before we get into the crux of what I want to chat about today, I want to tell you a bit more about me and about my studio, local projects. So I'm really passionate about storytelling. And that's actually how I found my way to local projects 7 years ago. We really are a studio that looks at design and technology in service of human stories. And that's the thing that has kept me there for these years and hopefully years to come. So we've done a bunch of projects across the globe. I've been part of a few of these on the screen now. So the Fashion for Good Center that opened up in Amsterdam a few years ago. It really focused on the sustainability within the fashion industry and educating consumers about their role and actions that they can take to become more sustainable as they think about their fashion choices. The Greenwood Rising Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that opened a couple of years ago, that focuses on the Greenwood district, aka Black Wall Street, and really talks about a full, robust story about the community there. Local Projects is really well known for the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York and a few others across the globe. So with that, I want to jump right on in. Today, I really want to discuss key considerations and questions to maybe bring up with yourself and your teams as you're going through the process of designing for impact. So my share back today is really a culmination of my own experiences on these projects, but also some recent learnings that I've pulled from a summit that I recently went to that was really interesting, hosted by Johns Hopkins. It was a culmination of architecture and neuroscience and thinking about building out intentional spaces. And a lot of the things that we discussed there really integrate well with designing for impact and considerations. And then also, I'm going to call out Jennifer Scott, who's on today. She is a client of ours with the National Urban League. And if you are aware of the project, we're working on the Urban Civil Rights Museum in Harlem, and going through this process of designing with her has really been super insightful and eye-opening for myself and our teams. And so some of what I'm actually going to share with you are things that we've reflected on together, and she actually highlighted in a recent presentation that we put together for the Society of Environmental and Graphic Designers conference that happened in August. So with that, I like to begin all of our projects with a bit of a North Star or a hypothesis, right? And so for me, my anchor is that I understand that exhibits have the power to humanize history, giving stories of the past to inform our present and embolden visitors to make future change. So this is something that I always kind of have at the forefront. And I understand that the power of exhibits, the power of experiences, but the real question is, how do we actually go about the process of designing for true impact, understanding the power that these experiences have? So one additional kind of point some recent learnings that were articulated from this summit that I went to that, again, really integrates well with kind of designing for impact and considerations. And these things seem pretty intuitive, but when I heard them kind of categorically stated, it was a real confirmation for me about the considerations, the things that we know to be true as we're going through this process. So one, we know design is not neutral, and designers are not neutral. Two, exhibits and other types of spaces communicate your values. And three, the process is as important as product. And I'll get into a little bit more of that when I talk about community engagement. But it's really important to remember and remind yourselves and your teams that the process is just as important, because there's so many learnings that come out of that that can be actually life-changing for folks. And then four, as we are building spaces and experiences for people, right? And so we need to think about and consider the fact that visitors are coming into this space with their own internal context, their own lived experiences. And so considering that as we're creating these spaces is also really important. So I want to start off with a little bit of an activity. And I would love for folks to throw this in the chat. And we won't discuss right now, we'll get back to it. But when you look at this image, this is an image I recently took. I was taking a walk, and I would love for folks to put in the chat what this image actually communicates to you, but not just to you. What do you think this image communicates to people that live in this neighborhood? So keep that at the forefront as we're going through this day, the rest of the presentation. So I'm a frameworks person. I like to think about frameworks. It makes things, it helps with complexity, and it helps bring things down to be digestible. And so there's this framework of questions that we go through this process. And there are basically three questions that we ask ourselves throughout, with some sub-questions under there. But it's why, what, and how. So first, let's dig into the why. Really understanding what the motivations are for the project or for the experience or for whatever your building is. So why is this project important to us as a whole? Why is it important to everyone that's going to engage with this work? And really understanding what your personal why is too, because that will keep you anchored throughout, what can be a challenging process sometimes. So, listening is really key here, listening to your clients, listening to the community, however that's defined, and also reminding yourself to listen to those voices in the room with you, because those are your partners. And so really understanding what they're bringing to the table as far as their lived experience, points of views, perspectives, and making sure that we're leading with the culture of listening and then actioning what you hear. The other thing is really understanding your personal why. And for me, at this stage in my career, my why is obviously rooted in creating intentional spaces, but it's also rooted in this longing to tell stories in their fullness, and telling stories that actually forefront resistance and agency, while also giving truthful context to educate people and to foster understanding. And so at this point in my life, I really want to change the way that people see things or potentially feel when they walk out of spaces. And so those are my personal whys. I will use two examples, two projects that we've worked on, just to give you a sense of kind of the whys for those projects. For the Urban Civil Rights Museum in Harlem, this why is really being driven by a desire to fill a void in the teaching of our history around the Black freedom struggle. From the moment that the first person of African descent set foot on this soil, and the impact and involvement of those in Northern urban centers in this fight. So when you think about civil rights and learning about civil rights, most of us think about the South, right? But the reality is that there was an infrastructure of support in the North. And so that story is not widely told. And so this is a space that's going to tell that story. The Greenwood Rising Museum in Tulsa. The why was really driven by also a need to tell a full and truthful story of the community, and really contextualize the tragedy and the massacre of 1921. Because for this community and for this client group, they really wanted to work towards this idea of racial reconciliation. But in order to do that, you first have to understand the context of the history and the community, and really also lean into telling kind of a more robust story about the community and the resilience of the community, who have continually built and rebuilt after tragedy after tragedy. So with that, let's get into the what. What do you want people to take away from this experience? When you're designing this space, what are people actually learning? What are they feeling? What do you want them to understand? And so there are different approaches to get to that what. But for me, kind of a leading approach is really about engaging the community. This is not a one size fits all. Community engagement, there's not a formula, right? But there are certain things that you can do and considerations to think about what the right approach is. And that will help you get to what the priorities are for the takeaways in the spaces that you're creating. So this image is an image from a forum that we held in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as we were designing Greenwood Rising. We kicked off the project with what we like to call a listening tour. And we went around, different community members sat with us, and we just sat there and listened, took notes. People who were excited about the project, people who were a little bit skeptical, people who categorically said, we don't want this museum here, and this is why. So we listened to all sides, we listened to all the folks, and we really tried to internalize that and take that back and work with the core client team, who's also in the community, on how to design this space, how to co-design this space with them. And then we took that back for an open public forum where people were able to give us feedback and were honest, and we were put on the hot seat, and it was not always comfortable, but that's when the good work happens. And so there were some takeaways from that I actually continue to apply to other projects. One of the takeaways was this idea of really not centering and steeping the story in trauma and oppression of the Black lived experience for this community, but in general, and telling kind of a more robust truth about who the community is and what the Black lived experience is like. And I've taken that learning and tried to apply that to a number of other projects that we're on. So some other considerations, and again, some of these are pulled from discussions that I've had with Jennifer and learnings on that project with her as well. So one, are we considering the current relationship of the site or the museum with its local communities? And so when you're thinking about the spaces that you're building, the experiences that you're building, again, every community is not the same. And so really understanding what the relationship of that community is to that story or to that site is key in thinking about how to engage with the community there. Two, developing an authentic way of engagement and creative ways to engage with communities in advance of the exhibit or during the process of design and development. And so again, as I mentioned, this is not a one size fits all. There is no formula. The next point actually will kind of feed into how you can build out those authentic and creative ways. The third point here is around immersing ourselves enough in the community to truly know who they are and what they actually want. At the summit that I mentioned, there was a woman on one of the panels who came from another country and was coming to the States, to a community in the South, a majority Black community in the South. She wanted to run some data and help this community make a case for getting some different resources based on the surveys and the data that she wanted to collect. And she was taken aback by the fact that when she came, she was met with a lot of skepticism, that there was a lot of pushback. And so her question to the audience was, how are we going to, how should I have approached this? And my question really to her was, well, how long did you spend courting that community before you jumped in and started to try to do the work, right? That you felt was in good intention and was good work, but had not really spent the time understanding who folks in the community are, what they want, what their needs actually are. And so this process is not an overnight process. And I mean, I've been in projects, part of projects that it's taken a year or more to court and to understand and to immerse yourself in the community appropriately. So that's something that we as designers, we need to think about as we're building out these experiences and working with our clients to really set the stage and the foundation there. So the kind of last part of the framework is the how. How do we humanize history, contextualize our present, and spur people to action? What are actually our techniques and our strategies for designing for impact? A couple of things here. So we do that by actually connecting to our visitors' humanity, right? We are building experiences and spaces for people. And sometimes I think we forget that. And people who have very different perspectives and lived experiences. So one kind of technique for us is this idea of immersion. Immersion allows for a deeper connection. The visitor becomes more emotionally invested in the narrative when they feel immersed in it, right? And so this also allows for the fostering of empathy and understanding. And so this image here is in reference to the barbershop that we created or recreated for the Greenwood Rising experience. The barbershop is a safe space. It's a place for the community to get their news, for people to joke and banter back and forth. And so we wanted to create that space early on in the experience so that the visitor felt like they can come in, get their hair cut, and listen to the banter that was happening back and forth through these barbers. Hopefully they made the connection that much of what they were talking about at that time in history is very relevant to what we talk about today. And so at this point, early on, they become part of the community so that when they get to some of the harder galleries that talk about oppression and tragedy, they have more of a visceral reaction because they feel like, okay, now I'm steeped in this story, I'm part of it. Another piece here is, that we create these experiences by telling a more robust and full truth. And there are some considerations there. And before I get into some of the images, I just want to do a bit of a trigger warning. There are some paraphernalia here, regalia that can be triggering. So I want to just give that warning before jumping into these images. So the first one is that telling a full and robust truth, it creates an increased awareness in the visitor. It gives them, it brings about a consciousness that was not there prior to the experience that you built, right? And so one way to tell a full and robust truth is actually, as a design team or as the agency, not to actually tell the story for folks, but provide a platform for folks to tell their own stories. And so in this image, this was actually a recreation of the massacre of 1921. It's an immersive experience, media driven. And what you hear overhead is actually excerpts of oral histories of survivors. So you're actually listening to their lived experience as you are in this space. And so why not give folks the opportunity to tell their own stories, to really provide a space to tell a more robust truth. The other consideration here is really the use of language. And so this image is one of the galleries that is part of a series of galleries we call the Arc of Oppression. And we designed this experience during 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd. And there were many galleries that we revisited the design of and the language that we used after post George Floyd, because we felt more of a boldness to be really clear with our language. I think this gallery was originally called Systems of Oppression. But we wanted to be really clear with the language that, these are actually systems of anti-Blackness in America. And so we are detailing those systems here and being really clear with the language that we're using. And so I implore you and your team to think about the language that you all use, because words obviously have power, and it's important to think about that. A few other considerations when thinking about the stories that are being selected in telling the full truth. So one, are you selecting stories that actually forefront human dignity and agency? And so this gets back to that point that I was making about not steeping everything in oppression and trauma, but using that to contextualize, but really selecting stories that show a different image and really push forward this idea of dignity and agency in lived experiences. Two, are you being brave and bold when you select stories and select how you're actually approaching the delivery of those stories? I pulled this quote from actually an article that Jennifer wrote recently from Robin D.G. Kelley about, are we actually emphasizing a respect on the difference, or are we rather critiquing power, right? And so really pushing ourselves and challenging ourselves to be those who are critiquing power, to break down and really make systemic change. Are we leaning towards things that are less controversial because we don't want to go there? And are we actually guiding our client teams to actually push the envelope a little bit more than maybe what they might even be comfortable with? Because I do think that we have an obligation to actually do the work of breaking down these systems. And being timid is not going to get us there. And then lastly, are we considering the cultural competencies needed within our teams to push the narratives that we're talking about? I think this came up a lot for us recently. And we had to be honest with ourselves about our design team makeup, who's at the table, what people know, what they don't know, what they understand, what they don't understand, and what is needed to support the process of their own learning, but then also how that's going to impact the outcome of the work that we're doing. And making sure that we are engaging with the right folks to bring people to the table so that we have a better understanding before we just jump into designing spaces. And so this is extremely important. And I can talk about this all day when we think about recruitment and design teams and agencies and who's in the studios. I won't go there today, but if anybody wants to talk about that, would love to. So again, thinking about cultural competencies needed within our teams to push these narratives. And then lastly, we need to really think about providing space for reflection and dialogue so that people can actually move to action if that is a goal, right? And so a lot of this information, we don't want to just overwhelm people and then just, leave it at that. We want to think about, are we providing space either at the end or throughout for reflection, for understanding and dialogue with others in the space as well? This is really a moment that we can call people to action in some way. This really allows visitors to digest, reflect, and ideate around their own action, which is always a motivation for me. And action can look very different for different folks, right? It doesn't have to be, I'm out marching, I'm protesting. It could be, I'm willing to have some critical conversations with the people around me, the people in my studio, the people at home. Those are moments of action that are really, really integral as well. So as a recap, these are the 3 questions that I really ask myself and ask our teams as we're going through this process. Why is the project important to us and to everyone? What do we want people to take away from this experience? And then how do we actually do this work? How do we get there? How do we humanize history? How do we contextualize it? And how do we spur people to action? And the last thing I really want to leave folks with is this idea of being accountable, and being accountable to yourself and communities, and making sure that you're holding yourself and your design team members accountable as you go through this work. So one, this kind of gets to that cultural competency note. Are we being honest about what we know and what we don't know? And are we fostering a space where people feel safe enough to say, you know what, I need to raise my hand. I don't really understand this. I feel like a fish out of water here. Are we creating those safe spaces for those conversations to happen within our studios? And then what are we doing to support the learning, right? Two, are we assessing whether our approach is feeding into tropes and further marginalizing communities? Because I think, it's easy, especially if you're going through a design process super quick, which all of us do, it's easy to say, okay, what's the easiest thing to push here, right? But we need to think about, are the stories that we're selecting leaning more heavily in tragedy and trauma than we should be? Are we providing a different perspective? What's different about coming to this space versus other spaces if we're not providing different perspectives, right? Thirdly, are we paying attention to place? Place is important. Where the space and experience is created is important. Understanding the community is important. So we really need to think about paying attention to place, as that will have a considerable impact on the way you design. And then lastly, are we taking care of visitors and communities? Something I didn't show in that arc of oppression area for Greenwood Rising is that it wasn't in the original plan, but after George Floyd, we decided to put in what we call an emotional exit. And this was really intentional to make sure that we are, taking care of our visitors that are part of a community that could be triggered or re-triggered with some of this content. And so the emotional exit is right off, it's like an annex off the Arc of Oppression galleries. It still tells the history, just a bit more generally, but it also, and it doesn't include some of the more triggering imagery or regalia, but it also does something, I think, much more important. It provides tools. So there's a document that the curator put together about what to do with your feelings as they're coming up in this moment. What are you feeling? How are you reacting? How to digest this. And our hope is that that toolkit will help you digest and reflect. And then maybe you're able to then kind of collect yourself and go through the full experience if you choose to. So just things to think about is, how are we taking care of people in our spaces? And that is it. So thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you, Ray. That was fantastic. If anybody has questions, put it in the chat and indicate whether you want me to ask or whether you would like to ask yourselves. I certainly have a lot of questions as well. So, this is super, super interesting. One of the things I really wonder is, a lot of the work that you guys are doing is around like new museums and like museums that are like, being considered for like a new space. But I know you've also kind of done things with like older institutions that have a lot of, kind of like they might have a lot of sort of like built-in identity and thoughts about their audience and thoughts about their interpretation. And I wonder how, how you've sort of challenged those clients to rethink, how they tell their story and who they tell it for.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so even for institutions that are not established, everyone is coming to the table with their own understanding of who they believe the target is, and who they believe their audience is. And to be totally transparent and honest, I think this is an area that we continue to work on, and think more about is how do we push ourselves to really think about the audience, and then how do we communicate that to our client teams on, we ask a lot of questions, and that's really the approach is like, let's prompt them, let's ask questions, let's find out too what work they've already done to validate these audience groups, right? And so I think enough of us have come to the table now with some experience in this that we know what questions to ask. And we know how to dig a little bit more to see if their understanding of their audience is really validated. And I think everybody also right now, they too understand that, I think I was looking at Pat's note, there is a lot changing in communities and neighborhoods and spaces. And so that means that people in those spaces are changing. So, who you thought your audience was or who you thought was close to the space that you are in now may no longer be.
Yeah.
So it's evolving. And I think leaning into the fact that it's evolving is key.
Very good. Very cool. All right. I'll just keep asking questions. I think actually one of the things that's really interesting is, I spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, and like Philadelphia is a place where like there is a lot of like evident history, and like there's a lot of like institutions and places that tell that history, but it's also a very specific history. And then I think what's also very interesting about some of the work that you guys have been doing is like there are a lot of communities out there that don't have museums, or they don't have like their history isn't evident in place. And I just wanted to know if like that was something that you could speak to, is like this idea of like like serving communities that aren't really telling their stories, or like where that place has become kind of where there feels like there's no they're there.
Yeah. So I think that's the exciting part. There's so much opportunity there. And I think it really, I mean, I think probably Ben, who's on, can attest to this, and some others in my studio, but like I'm really going out and evangelizing our work so that I can find those projects.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I want to do. So I'm looking, right? And I'm really using opportunities to connect with folks in communities, no matter how big or small your project is. It is I understand now that I want my life's work to be centered around telling those stories. And so I've been really motivated to seek that out. But yeah, I think, there's a conversation that we've also been having, not just in the studio, but industry wide, about, the fact that our agencies are also money making agencies, right? We're for profit. And so we have to also build into our considerations and our mindsets now that some of these smaller projects that tell some of these stories may not be the money grabbers, right? Like they're not going to be the things that are going to bring in a lot of cash, but it's important. And what is your studio's obligation to doing this work? What is it's more of a moral compass for me. And so it's important to think about ways to build an infrastructure in studios that will allow for leaning into some of the work on some of these other types of projects, and seeking out that work, and positioning yourself, and also doing the work so that you're prepared as a studio and as a team to actually build out these experiences. You can't jump into this blind. You have to educate yourself and your teams. That means trainings. That means going to the summit. That means, reading books. That means, like there needs to be some sort of learning opportunity so that we're equipped to actually help tell the stories that we say we want to tell.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because like I think looking through this, like I think some people find it very self-evident that like this is the way you do it, but like it's not really the way that architecture or advertising or brand design, like a lot of them are not structured in this way of like trying to like elicit the stories in the community and that co-creation.
It doesn't allow for that. Like our process, just be frank, our design process does not allow for the time it takes to work with communities, pull out the stories, dig, learn, understand. We're just, oftentimes we're just trying to get to the next milestone. And so you got to think about, how do we build that in to our work and our process? How are we honest with our internal teams, but also our client teams about that? There needs to be transparency around what it actually takes to do the work.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and buy-in from the top level too, because like if you're the director of a museum and you're like, this is my statement to the world, like to say like you're gonna cede space to your community is like that's a move, or like if you're like a very, very wealthy person on the board and you're writing a big check to make this thing happen, like you might want your story told, or your version of that story told above the communities. And like you have to make a very deliberate choice at that point to say like, no, like this is the way like it should be done.
Yeah,
Okay, well,
absolutely.
I'm sorry, go on.
One last thing, I think, we've been talking about this industry wide too. And I think, Josh, we had this conversation just about there is a shift now in the industry about who is prioritized in the process. I think traditionally, historically, it's been the designer, right? The starchitect, the star designer. That's not who is important. We are here in service of doing the work and doing good work and telling stories, right? And so we have to understand that we are in a service industry. That means we're serving people, and that we're not kind of, we want to create beautiful design, and we create beautiful design by also prioritizing and forefronting communities, their stories, building spaces where people feel dignified and feel like they belong, right? I mean, it gets to this image. So I'm from DC originally. I live here now. That image that I took was me taking a walk the other day. And I was just like, oh, I don't look up very often. And what I'm seeing is that old DC and new DC. And I'm thinking about, we're having a lot of challenges in the city. There's all this talk about what needs to happen. I'm like, well, what are we communicating through development, through design, to community members? We're telling folks they don't matter anymore, that the new guard is coming, or so it's important to think about the fact that we are making choices with design development that really impact how we all live in our communities. So
I love it. All right. Well, I'm gonna let some of our guests here ask questions. Angelica, do you want to ask your question? Or do you want me to ask your question?
If you could, I'm a little under the weather. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. I hope you feel better. How do you decide when the stories are leaning into too much trauma? Some visitors may be more sensitive than others. And how do you deliver true impact to visitors who know nothing of the story? In essence, where do you draw the line to get people to understand the severity of the traumatic event without necessarily reliving trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, again, it's not a one size fits all. I think when you're considering telling the story, the questions that I ask myself is, okay, have I stated enough context about this trauma or the oppression so that people understand the point that I'm trying to make as to, for example, folks talk about reparations. Reparations for some take different forms, right? But this was a conversation on Greenwood Rising. It's, we had to talk about the massacre of 1921 because you needed to understand what was taken away from the community and why, honestly, they deserve reparations. So how, I'm always building a case. Just to be very clear, I'm building a case, right? And so when we talk about giving context, it's really so that people understand the point for the case that I'm making, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, I that's great. It's also interesting because whenever we've kind of engaged in these things, we look a lot to like filmmaking and documentary filmmaking, and like there's a lot of people who've told stories in their mediums, and they have ways of pulling it off. And like this idea of telling stories in space, like some of it feels very new, but like how to like tell stories of trauma, like that has actually been processed in a lot of other mediums, and I think there's like things you can kind of take from them as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, I'm sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna let Lakia ask her question. Do you want to ask? Do you want me to read?
Oh, okay. I was preparing for you to read.
Oh, either way, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay, I'll just literally read it.
All right.
How do you resist that pressure towards, quick turnarounds and minimal staff time, like especially during the research and kind of conceptualization phases, which leads to the tropes. It leads to, the same archival images over and over, or the ones that are available at like a big stock house versus digging, the same informants again and again. And somebody else had a sub question, like when that pressure comes from the client sometimes, but then I really do want to ask when it comes from your firm, when they're thinking about bottom line and all of that, just how do you handle those kinds of situations?
Yeah, I mean, this is the the age old balance, right? And I don't, we haven't gotten fully there yet, right? But I think I lead with transparency, and I lead with honesty, and having the conversation, and again making a case for why we need more time for something, or and I think it helps to have that conversation at the outset as you are building out the plan and the scope of work, as you are pitching it to a client team. I think we've gotten really much better at our firm about like how do we have the right people at the table when we're pitching ideas and pitching plans and all of that, so that people with the experience of working on these projects day to day can say, hey, this subject matter, we don't have this in-house. We're going to need more time. We're going to have to build out more time for research or what have you. I think a couple of projects, I actually worked with the team to switch around phases and to say, like, we used to just kind of jump into like a strategy and a concept phase. And we, on a few projects, we changed it to starting with a research phase and a content development phase for a good chunk of time before we got into design. And that really changed the way we approach the project all the way throughout. There was a innate understanding now, like the story is leading, because we even switched around what our process was and how we did the work. So I think having the conversation early on at the pitch phases with your internal teams, speaking up about what's needed throughout the project, and continually making the case for why whatever you're asking for is actually needed.
Yeah, I was just gonna also say, I know that local projects and like same Luke that has like actual like interpretive like staff that do interpretation. Like we literally hire people and have people that like are in the team that do that. And I know there's a lot of there's like a fair number of these design agencies that just don't even staff for that. And it really is almost its own discipline.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Doug, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Hillary. It was a wonderful talk. You spoke about working closely with communities and letting folks tell their own stories with their own voices. I'm working with a Japanese Canadian internment memorial site, and a lot of the survivors there don't want to be giving voice to their own stories, don't want to speak up themselves. I think there's some cultural resistance to doing that. Maybe they're tired of sharing the stories. At the same time, there are families and younger communities, whether they're Japanese Canadian or not, that are coming to the site that find tremendous value in hearing those stories, and even find them useful as platforms to share their own stories amongst themselves or with others. And I was curious if you had encountered that kind of diversity in your communities you work with, diversity of willingness to share, to speak directly, and how you've maybe strategized working with that in response.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the reality is that they're not going to be the same perspectives in a community, right? And so people are going to have differing opinions about what should be shared, how to move on, how not to move on, how to, those are all conversations, right? And so one, I think we need to give space for that, and we need to be flexible so that those conversations can happen. That came up a lot for us on the Tulsa project, because there were many in the community who said, I don't want to relive this, right? Why are we talking about this anymore? And then there were many who said, no, we need to make a case for certain things, and this is a good way to do that. And we need to tell this story because we've not had space to tell this in our own way. And so I think, to answer your question, one, in the process, give space for those conversations to happen. Also understand, like, everyone's not going to be happy at the end of the day. There's still going to be people who are not happy that the narrative was told or whatever it may be. But do the due diligence to work with the community itself to figure out what is the right way to tell a story. What are the right things that we should be leaning into to make sure that you're you're being respectful of the story itself, the narrative, and of all those differing opinions on whether it should be told or not. Obviously, with Tulsa, we went ahead and built the experience. And I think some of those folks who were very much against the telling of this story in the community, they're now some of our actually biggest advocates, because they were able to see how respectful we were in the process, and how how we kept kind of coming back to them as necessary. So
yeah. And I love that thing that you said about the process being as important as the product. And I think that definitely shines through here. Jennifer Scott, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'll come on camera so I can also say hi, Lorraine. First of all, I just want to say I'm working with the Urban Civil Rights Museum in Harlem that Lorraine mentioned a couple times, and local projects on Lorraine's team you've just been a great partner. So I want to thank you publicly, but also all the things that she just said. People can sort of talk and it sounds fluffy and wonderful, but they really did hold themselves accountable through this process. That's been really intense and iterative and creative. So they've been true to her word, true to their word, and figuring this out and being sensitive to storytelling. So thank you. And my question was just thinking about your tool of immersion, which I know has so many benefits in storytelling and design, because it gets tricky with balancing that in cross-cultural experiences, because you're inviting people to step into experience they may not be used to, sometimes a trauma that is outside of their cultural experience. So I'm just wondering how you've thought about that and think about it and approach it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach and the way to design is refined every project. And so I think we are just, we're taking from learnings from, more recent projects with the immersion piece. I think this came up on a project that I'm actually not part of, but the use of like Pepper's Ghost, and recreating immersive experiences with, community members. And is that appropriate? Is that kitschy? Is that, so I think, to answer your question, I don't know that we've landed that fully. I think in the immersive experiences that we've created thus far, we've had the conversations with the communities about the actual experience. And if they feel like this hits the right note, if they feel, that it's not respectful or the approach is not the right one, we've given space for that type of feedback. So especially for communities that we're not part of, I think that again is key. It's like, we're co-designing, one, so we're trying to do this together, and then two, asking questions about and testing it and seeing, how people actually feel in these spaces, and if we're hitting the right notes, or if we're doing things that are a little bit off.
All right, that's great. So all right, so we're near the end of our session. So one of the things I've been trying to do is just like give you the stage for some parting words, or like things that you would have the audience do, or ways that they can support you or follow you, or you have the stage.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm just so grateful for this space, and I put my email up previously. I'll just do it again. But please, if you want to connect, have conversations. I love to have conversations. I love to learn. I really want there to be more kind of industry sharing across studios about best practices and things that we're learning. So please reach out. That's probably the best way. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me on IG at Arthur-Mensah. And yeah, thank you for sharing space and time with me today. I'm very grateful.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Lorraine, again. It was really fantastic to see you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope to see you next week or in the very near future. If we don't see you next week, have a wonderful holiday, everybody. And we'll catch you soon. Thanks again, Lorraine. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
All right.